Thanks very much, Nathan, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I can't think of a better place for my first talk to a live audience since the American Caesars came out a few days ago than here in a community bookstore, certainly where my professional life first began, when I had a bookstore in England, in Greenwich. And I live locally, and I'm proud to be a customer as well as an author of books that are sold here. I'd like to tell you this evening briefly a little bit about the genesis of this book, a little bit about what's in the book, and finally, why the book may actually be quite important in the coming 2 years as we move towards the next presidential election. So let's start with the genesis. Almost 30 years ago, on a research trip that I made to some American military archives, I was asked by Russ Wiggins, the former editor of the Washington Post, who'd retired to own and run a small newspaper in Ellsworth, Maine, what I intended to do following Monty, my official 3-volume biography of the famous World War II Field Marshal, who led the American and British armies in the D-Day landings. I confided to him that day an idea that had been growing during my travels in the United States, namely that I should move here and write a new book about JFK, who'd been president when, as a student, almost half a century ago now, I had interned on the Washington Post and had briefly lived with Russ in the summer of 1963. The more I think of your idea for a book on Kennedy, the better I think of it, Russ wrote to me in April 1982, some years later. It would be worthwhile to put his administration in its proper place in history. It really was the high point of American acceptance of a role of world leadership. All that fell apart with incredible rapidity in the years that followed. A great consensus that was formed from 1940 on simply disintegrated. So a portrait of American power at its peak might be a great contribution to biography and history. In his newspaper, the Ellsworth American, Russ Wiggins later capped his letter to me by writing an article in 1987 about my Montgomery trilogy that he entitled A Great Biography of Monty. And it ended with a brief account of my visit to his home in 1982, when we'd attended his local annual Chamber of Commerce dinner and had met with his local congressman, among others. Quote, Nigel was in the United States doing research on the last 2 volumes of the Biography of Montgomery and seemed to enjoy a little diversion in a community a long way from the controversies of his subject matter. Probably not many people who met him then will remember a gentle, quiet young man destined to become one of the great biographers of our time. Well, I don't know about being one of the great biographers. The first volume of my JFK biography, JFK Reckless Youth, did become a New York Times bestseller and was dramatized as an ABC television miniseries starring Patrick Dempsey. It was also translated into numerous foreign languages. But as for the portrait of American power at its peak, sadly, the reception here in Boston and at the various Kennedy compounds was terrible. And since the staff of the Kennedy Library walked on eggshells in order not to upset the Kennedy family, it was made clear to me I would never again be helped in my research. In fact, Kennedy stalwarts from Arthur Schlesinger to Dick Goodwin and his wife Doris were warned to have nothing more to do with me. Rightly or wrongly, I gave up and returned to England to teach the history and practice of biography. I came back to the States in 2000, however, to tackle a Kennedy-esque figure, President Bill Clinton. I resettled in Boston, which I consider now my hometown, with an office at the McCormack Institute of the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I researched and wrote the first 2 volumes, published in 2000 and 2007. And those of you who access the Huffington Post will be aware of my frustration watching a replay today of the events I described in 1994, when Republicans declared a contract with America and won both the House and the Senate. History as tragedy, I've called my blog post this morning. Anyway, to solace myself, I wrote after my Clinton volumes 2 small books on the history and practice of biography for Harvard University Press, our local university publisher. But every time I traveled abroad, I found myself more and more ashamed of the decisions made by the 43rd president during my time here. And when my London editor suggested a modern version of the great Suetonius history of biography of the Roman emperors, the 12 Caesars, written almost 2,000 years ago, I leapt at the opportunity. That's my copy from 30 years ago. I would, in that case, be able to write about true greatness, exemplified in the modern day in Franklin D. Roosevelt, and about the later decline of the great empire which FDR had established during the terrible administration of the 43rd president, George W. Bush. President by president, I'd be able to show how they came to power, how they responded to the challenges of their time, and at the end of each chapter, a little bit about their personalities as individuals, as reflected in their private lives, just as Suetonius had done with Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, Caligula, Tiberius, Nero, and their successors. Now, I'm sure you have questions you'd like to pose, either in disagreement with my judgments of the presidents or beyond what I've written, especially concerning our 13th Caesar. But I'd like to give you a flavor of the new book itself and the spirit in which it was written. Undoubtedly, the greatest of our Caesars since the United States became an empire in World War II was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The patience and realism with which he guided the nation in its war effort, the authority with which he dominated his often prima donna generals and admirals, still awes me as a military biographer. Indeed, I'm now working on a new book, Commander-in-Chief, FDR and the Military. But at the end of my first chapter in American Caesars, after detailing the Herculean efforts of the president, I tell what is to me the most deeply touching story of FDR's private life, at the center of which is the genuine love affair, and I stress the word love, that he had with his wife's secretary, the beautiful Lucy Mercer. Now, not many of you may know, but in 1935, FDR suggested to the author Fulton Oursler a magazine series by different detective novelists that would be devoted to the theme of how a rich man, quote, married for 20 years, but with a wife who bores him and is tired of these are Roosevelt's words, the hollowness of all the superficial friendship surrounding him, could engineer an escape in order to begin a secret life in some small town where he can escape his past. The series to be called The President's Mystery Story.